I would like to welcome you, Steve. It's really a pleasure to speak about the World Data Forum that's taking place this October. It was supposed to take place in Bern, but we are going to have it virtual. But we had a preparatory conference a couple of weeks ago, and I would like to have your views on what were the main takeaways from that meeting.
Well, thanks, Maya, and thanks for the invitation to speak. So, as you said, the Swiss government have organized a number of smaller preparatory conferences in advance of the plenary World Data Forum, which they call the Road to Bern. So, a few weeks ago, we met online and we were discussing data sharing. And that was the theme for that conference. So we were discussing the complexities of data sharing. What does data sharing mean? What does data sharing mean? What does data mean? And we were trying to tease out those issues. And the idea is to whet people's appetite and get them thinking about these really important issues before we get to the main conference.
You have also written a paper connecting the Sustainable Development Goals, objectives, and the data that is sort of indicators that are missing. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, well, I published a paper a while ago, and what I was trying to do in that paper was explain the challenges involved with populating what's called the global indicator framework. So the SDGs have completely redefined what development means. So now it's not just about poverty alleviation and hunger alleviation. It's now about sustainable development in the sense of addressing the climate crisis, sustainable consumption and production, addressing well-being. So it's a hugely more complex proposition now than the Millennium Development Goals. And because of that, the data demands are so much more challenging for statisticians. And what we were trying to do in this paper, myself and a colleague, Bojan Nastav, was to look at alternate ways of addressing that challenge. So the traditional way has been that the National Statistical Office looks for more resources and then tries to measure more and more indicators. But the time frame for the Sustainable Development Goals is quite short. So given that there's not a lot of additional resources available, and given that the time frame is quite tight, we kind of thought, well, maybe there's other ways to address this problem. And one of the ways that we were proposing was to try and harness what you could call citizen science, but also data held by NGOs, by academics, and provide a framework that would allow you to assess and verify the quality of those statistics and validate them and say, look, that they're good enough for the purposes of measuring the SDGs. And that's the basic premise of the paper.
Yes, indeed. I was fascinated by this aspect of how can we gather this data? Where is this data? Is it belongs to the private sector? Should the private sector companies like social media platforms or big organizations like Alphabet and Google and Amazon be sharing this data? Or what other sort of data are you looking into that you could perhaps validate, accredit that they would be good enough for use for measuring if you have achieved the SDGs objectives?
Well, there's a lot wrapped up in that one question. So first of all, it's not just private sector data. So by all means, the social media platforms and so on have data that could be of use to statisticians, but equally academics, NGOs, scientific groups, there's a whole range of players in what you could call the data ecosystem. And we haven't really tapped into those sources. So when you're trying to produce a global indicator, what you want is to try and make sure you've got good coverage in all the countries, but you want to make sure as well that the data are globally comparable. So for example, if you're looking at a forestry cover, something like that, an alternate source might be to get data from NOAA, from the satellites. And you can use that data to work out what the land coverage is. That has advantages from a global point of view, in that data will be comparable across all the countries. The disadvantage, though, is the SDGs are very much country-led, and countries themselves may feel uncomfortable that the statistics about their country are coming from a different source and that they don't have control over. And this is one of the issues that we're trying to address. So that there's a kind of you could call it a healthy tension, as there always is as things progress, between the global perspective and the national perspective. So that's one issue. And another issue to be unpicked is the whole issue of privacy. So, do statisticians have the right to access data from social media platforms? There's a contested issue around who owns that data, because they're harvesting the data from your phone, but they hold it. But who owns it? Is it their data or is it your data? And that then complicates the discussions about, well, do they have the right to give that to anybody else? Do we have the right to access it? And then obviously there's technical issues as well around bias and so forth. But the big issues are around the kind of openness of those types of data. So, and that's why those conferences are so interesting, because there's lots and lots of issues to unpick.
Yes, and there is another preparatory conference coming up in August, I believe, right?
Yes. I'm trying to, I forget who's hosting it, because what they do is usually two agencies co-host. So the one that I spoke at back in February was co-hosted by the World Meteorological Organization and the World Health Organization. I think it's the United Nations Commission for Europe, and somebody else is hosting the next conference. And I'll be on a panel on that discussing something, but I can't remember what off the top of my head.
Oh yes, I remember you mentioned you're going to be one of the keynote speakers, like you were before.
I was a keynote speaker in the first conference. In this one, I'll be a panelist.
A panelist. But yes, I remember now. You had this very interesting idea, which was to bring together two debating groups that would discuss whether we should be using the data that's not currently the National Statistics Office's or official data, to complement the data sets in order to better measure the objectives of the Sustainable Development Goals.
Yeah, correct. So for the World Data Forum itself, so for the plenary that's scheduled for October, or was scheduled for October, we had put in a proposal. So often in conferences, the traditional way is one person or several people get up and they present their idea, and then there's some questions. We thought, given that this idea of accreditation or homologation it's quite controversial, and in fact there's a discussion platform dedicated to it on the Statistical Journal of the IOS. Because it's controversial, we thought, well, why not actually leverage the controversy, and instead of just doing a presentation, we'll get two people to propose it, and we'll get two people to oppose it, and we'll actually have a full-on debate, and then we would ask the audience to vote and just see who convinced them. So it's to try and break away from the more traditional conference style, make it a little bit more combative, maybe a bit more fun.
That's good. That's a good way to get people engaged on the discussion, right? And there are so many aspects. It's a good format, to have the debating groups, and then the reminder of the audience, the group to discuss and vote, right? I think it's a good way to advance the final presentations and discussions that will take place in October.
Thought so. We thought so, because I think when you're presenting, sometimes they're very anxious not to offend anybody else. And we don't want to offend anybody, but we thought maybe by setting up a debate, it kind of forces people to start picking holes in the other arguments. So it maybe cuts to the chase a bit faster.
Yeah, move out of your comfort zone, and
exactly.
then you have some breakthroughs, like maybe you change your mind in a good way, right? Because that's the idea, right? You could advance and see, you know, the advantages of another way of
and above all else, it might be a bit of fun.
Exactly, right? Everybody likes a little bit of competition. So very well, thank you so much. It was a pleasure speaking with you. And I hope we'll speak soon again. It's Steve MacFeely from the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. Thank you.
Thanks, Maya.